Hello, my name is Anika Quinana, and the name of my capstone is Beyond a Seat at the Table, Diversity in Arts Organizations. This capstone was successfully presented in fulfillment of the Master's in Arts Management degree in the College of Visual and Performing Arts at George Mason University on Friday, May 4th, 2018. The U.S. Census has projected that the racial and ethnic makeup of the United States will change greatly in the next 4 decades. According to Pew Research, people of color made up 38% of the U.S. population in 2015 and are expected to make up 51% of the U.S. population in the 2050s. This so-called minority majority will impact every sphere of American life, including the workforce. For-profit companies have been exploring the impact of this change in the business world and have determined that diversity drives innovation, creativity, and financial growth. The nonprofit sector is grappling with its own ongoing diversity challenges. Although studies have shown that professionals of color have similar education backgrounds and the same desire to enter the nonprofit workforce as their white counterparts, the nonprofit world has been stagnant in developing a diverse staff. Moreover, efforts to create space for more leaders of color in nonprofit organizations have been unsuccessful. In spite of professional development initiatives in the past 2 decades, less than 20% of executive director positions have been held by people of color in the nonprofit sector. What about arts organizations? Have boards of directors and senior leadership become more diverse? Are people of color, women, LGBTQ, and/or disabled professionals leading arts organizations? What are the perceived challenges and barriers to building diverse leadership in arts organizations? We already know that conversations about diversity are traversing the art sector's landscape. Arts organizations have turned to new programming to draw diverse audiences, and community engagement activities and staff positions have been developed in response to the realities of a changing society. Do these efforts to build diversity resonate in the top levels of arts organizations? As we know, boards work with the senior leadership to steward the mission, vision, and goals of arts organizations. If diversity can increase arts organizations' ability to be innovative, creative, and thus achieve mission, then the intentional effort to bring diverse perspectives and voices to senior staff and boards should be a priority, just as much as finding ways to engage diverse audiences is a priority. This capstone will question if the leadership of arts organizations continues to lack in important demographic categories that reflect where the U.S. population is headed. It will explore if arts organizations are prepared for the future and positioned to lead arts innovation with diverse boards and senior leadership at their helms. Most importantly, I will consider the significance of increasing leaders of color in the sector. What impact would that have in a society where most of the population will be racially and ethnically diverse by the 2050s? To explore these issues, I will analyze demographic research from studies conducted in the nation's two largest and most diverse arts markets, Los Angeles County and New York City, and by one of the nation's leading arts bodies, Americans for the Arts, or AFTA. I will start by providing a general background of each research study I am using to inform this capstone, and then I will look at each of their demographic surveys to explain what I found out about their board and senior leadership diversity. I will look at specific demographic categories, namely gender, sexual orientation, disability, and race and ethnicity, because these are the areas where most diversity efforts focus. I will then compile and compare research from all three studies, but will focus on demographic categories of women and people of color. Then I will compare their research on women and people of color to recent and projected U.S. population data. You will see that percentage-wise, there are almost as many women leading arts organizations as there are women in Los Angeles County, in New York City, and in current and projected U.S. population trends. And the percentage of women in arts leadership sometimes surpasses the percentage of women in the population. The picture is very different in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. In my comparison of arts leaders of color to wider Caucasian arts leaders, you will see very quickly that there is a huge disparity in the percentage of arts leaders of color. Los Angeles County and New York City are racially and ethnically diverse regions. So what are the implications of not having that diversity more equally reflected in arts leaders? The United States is not as racially and ethnically diverse now as it will be in the future. But these studies will show that racial and ethnic diversity of arts leaders is still behind current population data and may continue to lag behind if efforts are not made to build racial equity and inclusion in arts leadership. Ultimately, I will argue and explain that a continued lack of racial and ethnic diversity in arts leaders will have a negative impact on the arts field, with the potential to damage the performance and growth of the field, working against all the efforts to attract diverse audiences. I will end with conclusions and some suggestions for further research studies. The AFTA Baseline Demographic Survey of the Local Arts Field 2017 is an anonymous demographic survey sent to over 9,000 local arts field representatives, including the organization's board, staff, and members. The purpose of the survey is to continue the organization's strategy to build diversity, equity, and inclusion in the local arts sector. I obtained the survey results from the report on AFTA's website. I requested raw data, but the organization is unable to share that information at this time. The Los Angeles County Arts Commission, LACAC, conducted a 2017 study with the purpose of strengthening diversity, equity, and inclusion in the arts and culture sector for the benefit of all Los Angeles County residents. The study included the development and guidance of an advisory committee, feedback from 14 town hall meetings, and recommendations from working groups, and a workforce diversity survey. Finally, the 2015 Diversity Survey of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs grantees was developed to create a baseline for understanding diversity among New York City's arts organizations. It has two components. One is a spreadsheet completed by each organization's executive director to share demographic information on its workforce. The other component was a survey questionnaire where the same organization heads shared their perceptions about successes and challenges around diversity in their organization. I obtained the research on ICPSR's website and ran queries to determine diversity amongst board members and leadership. Unlike the other two studies, the New York City study didn't ask questions about sexual orientation. As I review the diversity information in each study, please look closely on each graph and see by colors and sizes and percentages where there is a lot of diversity in certain categories and where there is not. First, the AFTA study. I'm looking specifically at the female and male categories. There are considerably more female members and female staff than male members and staff. There are also more female board members with a difference of 5%. Although there are some respondents who identify as LGBTQ, the majority identify as heterosexual or straight. In the disability category, The responses are broken down by those who identify as having a disability. Few respondents said they have a disability. In the race and ethnicity demographic, most of the respondents identified as white. When I total all the people of color categories, we can see clearly how few respondents identify as people of color. While all these categories are important, the information from the gender and race and ethnicity categories are the most significant. First, most of AFTA's arts members, staff, and board members are women, and their numbers reflect or surpass the current and projected U.S. population data. But leaders of color percentages are all lower than recent and projected U.S. population data. In the LACAC study, there are more female board members and senior staff than male board members and senior staff. In terms of sexual orientation, most respondents said they are not LGBTQ. While with disability, most respondents do not have disabilities. With race and ethnicity, most of the board members and senior staff are white. And when we combine all the people of color in the relevant categories, we can see the huge disparity between white and people of color arts leaders in the study. Just like in the AFTA study, there are more female arts leaders than male arts leaders in the LACAC study. Female arts leaders also reflect recent population data in Los Angeles County. On the other hand, leaders of color respondents' percentages are significantly lower than the people of color percentages in Los Angeles County. In the New York City study, there are more females in leadership but less on boards. This is the first time we are seeing more males in a category, but the margin is only a 6% difference. In the disability demographic, board members do not have a disability, but in the leadership category, respondents either decline to state or they have disabilities. Finally, in the race and ethnicity demographic, as with all the other studies, most respondents are white. And when we combine all the people of color in the respective categories, we see how large the gap is between white arts leaders and arts leaders of color. Again, there are more women arts leaders than male arts leaders. Unlike the other two studies, women make up less of the board composition of responding organizations. For the first time in these studies, female board members' percentages are lower than male board members, but in the leadership category, women are still higher than the New York City's recent population of women. Like Los Angeles County, New York City is a city comprised primarily of people of color. However, arts leaders of color make up less than 23% of responding arts organizations, and these numbers don't reflect recent population trends in New York City. Now let's look at all disability in all the studies combined. here we see that most respondents are able-bodied. In the sexual orientation categories, most respondents are heterosexual. In the gender and race and ethnicity categories, I will compare all the studies to each other. Then I will add in the population data to see how the leaders of color reflect it and how the gender category reflects it. In the gender category, in all three studies, there is a lot of equity across the studies. And when we add in the population data for gender, there continues to be a lot of equity in the gender category among women, with some spikes in AFTA's members and staff, female percentages. However, there are disparities in the race and ethnicity in all of the studies. And when we add in the population data to the race and ethnicity categories, it's clear that arts leaders of color percentages are almost opposite to the local Los Angeles County and New York City populations. And they are behind U.S. current and projected population trends. So while there is gender equity, the arts field lacks racial and ethnic diversity. Now that we know from these surveys that there are significantly less arts leaders of color than their white counterparts, and that the population is more racially and ethnically diverse than the arts leaders represented in those cities, we need to see what insights we can gain from perceptions on diversity and leadership from the arts, nonprofit, and for-profit sectors. But first, I will discuss some of the difficulties I had in comparing the responses. The major challenge was that each study uses different terminology and or distinguishes the demographic categories in different ways. First, AFTA had many categories in their survey, but they did not break out staff from senior staff. The other two studies do break out organizational leaders from other staff, but they also use different terms. LACAC uses the term senior staff, and the NYC study uses the term leadership to speak about the senior leaders within the organization. The challenge with the term leadership in the New York City study is that the respondents could also choose their job type as marketing or development, as well as leadership. So there is no way to know if these respondents who responded as marketers or development staff are also senior leaders within their organization. My hope is that by using the terms senior staff and leadership, I am capturing responses from executive directors in arts organizations. But this is hard to tell. All three studies use the term board members, but AFTA's study only refers to board members within AFTA's organization. The study doesn't break down the board members who may be represented within AFTA's many networks and constituents. In the gender category, the studies are essentially asking the same question, but in different ways, and some ask with more detail. The fact that the AFTA study uses a great deal of detail in their gender categories is a credit to the study and to the responses they may be able to collect in the future. However, most respondents identified as either a man or a woman or male or female, with a small percentage who didn't wish to identify or declined to state. The New York City study didn't ask about sexual orientation, but both of the other studies surveyed this demographic. Respondents in the AFTA study were asked to choose a sexual orientation category, whereas in the LACAC study, respondents were only asked if they identify as LGBTQ. In the disability category, AFTA's respondents were only asked to respond if they had a disability. The LACAC study asked people to respond if they had a disability or not. And the New York City study asked for people to respond if they didn't have disabilities, and then the study lumped together people with disabilities with those who declined to state. This not only makes it difficult to compare the responses in all studies, but it makes me question the reliability of the responses in the New York City study. It was only the race and ethnicity category that had very similar categories across all three studies. Even though each study was created uniquely for a geographic focus, the fact that each study uses different terminology makes it difficult to be sure that comparisons are accurate. Each study claims to want to set a benchmark for the field and to work collaboratively with other regions. Standardizing questions, categories, and terms would assist in that effort and help researchers to be confident in comparing the information. For example, the sexual orientation and disability responses are not clear enough to compare to each other, and the current and projected population data on sexual orientation and disability consider a lot of different variables that don't align with my capstone. Now let's look at perceptions of diversity from the arts, nonprofit, and for-profit sectors. I interviewed Clayton Lord, Vice President for Local Arts Advancement at AFTA, to learn more about their cultural equity policy. AFTA has had some form of this policy for more than 2 decades. However, in recent years, the Board of Directors revised the policy with the goal of making it broad enough for internal staff and local arts agencies to use. The policy begins to support a full creative life for all. AFTA commits to championing policies and practices of cultural equity that empower a just, inclusive, equitable nation. It goes on to say that cultural equity embodies the values, policies, and practices that ensure that all people, including but not limited to those who have been historically underrepresented based on race, ethnicity, age, disability, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, socioeconomic status, geography, citizenship status, or religion, are represented in the development of arts policy, the support of artists, the nurturing of accessible, thriving venues for expression, and the fair distribution of programmatic, financial, and informational resources. It includes an acknowledgement of historical systems of power and inequality. It includes AFTA's commitment to dismantling them and the overall strategies that the organization wants the local arts field to employ to create sustainable, equitable change. Clayton emphasized that AFTA's policy is a cultural equity policy, very different than a racial equity policy. He explained that, depending on geographic location, local arts agencies find that trying to address issues like racial inequity head-on only creates more barriers in the field. So a cultural equity policy allows them to focus on broader issues like class, which often overlaps with race, and gives a greater ability to achieve broader equity goals. AFTA has shared their own policy with the local arts field and has provided a template so that local arts organizations can create their own policies. AFTA also provides local arts agencies with the expertise to support the development of local cultural equity policies. Clayton said that the most challenging internal issue in addressing diversity needs is time. Some ways that AFTA has worked to implement their cultural equity policy has included staff-initiated diversity and leadership training, and a shared responsibility between human resources and program leadership to identify a diverse candidate pool. Some specific strategies to diversify staff are: 1. To value experience over education, so that advanced degrees are not required for some positions. 2. To incentivize staff to identify diverse candidates from within their own professional networks. And 3. To find new places to post jobs that might attract diverse candidates. Still, these efforts require time to see if the change will come about, and Clayton admits that AFTA has no clear measures at this point to determine if their strategies are working. At present, the responses from their study tell us that AFTA's staff and board and the local arts agencies that they support are not diverse, and they do not reflect the diversity of the United States. The LACAC Town Hall meeting and working group participants discussed barriers to diversity and made recommendations to improve diversity in arts leadership. These barriers included: board diversity is directly linked to hiring diverse leadership. So this implies that if your board is not diverse, they won't hire diverse leaders. There is no clear pipeline to upper level positions when hiring happens through professional, homogeneous networks. Leaders from culturally specific organizations may not be valued or considered for a leadership position in mainstream organizations. Potential employers assume that the pool of candidates of color is too small, inaccessible, or that candidates lack requisite experience. Young people often assume that a career in the arts is limited only to art makers. People at the early stages of career development often lack knowledge about viable career paths within arts and culture, especially as it relates to positions in leadership and management. Transgender persons may be particularly disadvantaged when it comes to being considered for positions in arts and cultural organizations. Participants recommend, among other things, that organizations develop policies that will incentivize funded organizations to build a diverse staff and board. This could include making the creation of equity policies mandatory for funded arts organizations. Participants believe that arts organizations need to lead change. It is their role to create an environment that is conducive to diversity. In the New York City study, the survey questionnaire included questions about perceived barriers to increasing diversity among leadership and board members. Some respondents said that there wasn't a viable pipeline of diverse candidates. These organizations appear to be steeped in the myth that people of color are not prepared to lead. The Building Movement Project, BMP, surveyed thousands of nonprofit sector respondents and found that respondents of color were more likely than white respondents to aspire to leadership. They have similar experience, skills, and educational backgrounds to their white counterparts. Perceptions that the pipeline is lacking, which we have seen discussed in the LACAC and the New York City studies, come from bias systems, BMP says, where professionals of color get passed over for leadership positions. Recruiters are not scouting them, boards are not supporting them, and they are getting ruled out for not being a, quote, good fit. Community Wealth Partners research supports BMP's study. They say that white nonprofit leaders often recruit from within their own networks, comprised of a homogeneous applicant pool. They hire based on implicit biases, like interviewing those with, quote, white-sounding names and selecting white candidates over candidates of color with the same skills. But McKinsey demonstrates that diverse companies outperform those that lack diversity, in gender diversity by 15% and in ethnic diversity by 35%. The Council on Nonprofits points out that when a nonprofit's board reflects the diversity of the community served, the organization will be better able to access resources in the community through connections with potential donors and/or collaborative partners and policymakers. Also, a diverse board will improve the nonprofit's ability to respond to external influences that are changing the environment for those served and in which it is working. Diverse boards will also make better decisions. When a nonprofit board is facing a major decision, diverse perspectives on the board are better qualified to identify the full range of opportunities and risks. Finally, boards that are not diverse risk becoming stagnant. For example, if all the board members travel in the same social circle, identifying and cultivating new board members will be a constant challenge. In conclusion, diversity is an ongoing issue in arts leadership and boards. Women are not as well represented on boards as they are among staff and senior staff, but overall, women are leading the arts by much higher numbers than arts leaders of color are. We need clearer and more reliable questions and universal terms on disability and sexual orientation, and this may come over time. However, the extreme contrast between leadership among women and people of color and the population data show that the field is not racially and ethnically diverse and needs to face this challenge going forward. The arts sector has shown that it places importance on building diversity in outreach and programming. It recognizes that the changing population demographics mean that the sector needs to find ways to draw new audiences with relatable programming that draws people to the arts, especially toward people of color. Implicit in this effort to bring diversity to arts programming is an acknowledgement that the sector has always been biased, especially with regard to race and ethnicity, and this historical inequity must be considered when planning the field's future. Diversity brings innovation, creativity, and financial growth, all factors that are critical to the sustainability of arts organizations. Studies show that racial diversity improves financial performance, even more than gender diversity does. Diversity is a key factor to growth in the field and should be crucial in planning for an eminently diverse country. Additionally, there are consequences for the sector if it doesn't reflect the population it serves. If we look at the LGBTQ and disability categories, we see that the responses are problematic. Over 80% of all those asked in the studies identified as heterosexual and able-bodied. However, the responses were collected differently and/or inadequately in each study. These are areas that require further and continued research. Though all the studies discussed in the capstone speak to the importance of LGBTQ and disability categories, the stigma and discrimination that often comes from identifying with one or both of these categories could make it difficult to get reliable information. While these are important categories for arts leadership, the demographic information in these studies compared to population trends show that the disparity of arts leaders of color in general and in relation to population data And the additional research I've shared shows the positive impact of diverse leaders in general and leaders of color in particular in decision making, creativity, and growth, bearing witness to the fact that diversity strategies should prioritize racial and ethnic diversity. The AFTA, LACAC, and New York studies also give insight to whether arts organizations are positioned to value diverse thinking and leadership into a diverse future. As organizations continue to collect demographic information, they should consider if the results reflect the U.S. population and use population data as a benchmark to determine how ready the sector is to bring arts to an increasingly diverse society, and if that diversity is reflected in organizational leadership. These studies and the research confirm what we already know, that arts leadership does not reflect the diversity of the population it serves. Racial and ethnic diversity should be our highest priority, and the organizations should actively pursue ensuring that arts leaders and boards are racially and ethnically diverse, because diversity has the greatest ability to improve the arts field. Thank you.